Welcome everyone to Core Volunteer Training. We're in week 9 of our program. We've had a wonderful series so far, and tonight we're continuing that tradition with the topic of Grasstops outreach and overviewing the endorsement program. Really in luck to have an expert on this topic. In fact, the gentleman that created the very endorsement program and database himself, Mr. Peter Bryn, will be our host tonight. Peter comes by way of a career in ExxonMobil. He actually was, after that, the regional coordinator down here in Texas before I took over the role for him so that he could become CCL's conservative director for the past several years.
Well, thanks, Brett, and thank you to everybody for being on the call tonight. Hopefully, Brett didn't oversell me too much. I'll try to live up to the introduction. So our learning goals for tonight are, after tonight's lesson, to be able to understand better CCL's Endorser program, what it is, what it's all about, to recognize and locate the outreach database, which is our central organizing tool for the program, and to work with your chapter and or action teams on endorsement. We'll explain what an action team is as well, and then we'll go into a partner activity. So tonight's agenda: if you've been on these calls before, you've probably heard Brett talking about, or the other speakers talking about, the 5 levers of political will. That is how we break out our activities. So we'll review that just to level set a little bit. We'll then talk about what is the opportunity with the Endorser program and how do we capture that opportunity. We will review the Endorser program itself and, again, the outreach database that is our central feature of the program. We'll give a quick overview of how are we doing, what progress have we made. This program's been around for about 2 years, and maybe 2.5, 3 years now, actually. Getting started, we'll show you how to get started, and then we'll break into the partner exercise. So let's start by putting the program into context of CCL's 5 levers of political will. So we sort of break out our activities into 5 broad categories. The first is development, and that basically means developing ourselves as volunteers, educating ourselves, developing our chapters. If you're a group leader, that means hosting a monthly meeting and attracting new volunteers to your group. If you're not a group leader, I'm sure your group leader would very much appreciate your help in this area. Development, I like to call it just keeping the lights on, keeping things going and getting volunteers involved. Once you have that base of a chapter and volunteers, you can begin actually going out and outreaching in the community. The first thing that leads to our next lever, which is lobbying. That includes going to DC, calling a member of Congress, meeting with a member of Congress's office and staff locally, building that relationship up, generating letters to Congress, everything with lobbying. The third lever is media. This is, of course, writing letters to the editor, meeting with your local newspaper, writing op-eds, things like that. The fourth is grassroots outreach. This is reaching out to people in the community through tabling events, through giving presentations to local clubs and things like that. And finally, the Grasstops outreach, that's kind of the other side of that coin, which is reaching out to community leaders, getting them involved and trying to seek their support. And that's the topic for tonight's discussion. So what is the opportunity with endorsements? And I'd like to start by giving a few examples. So of course, we see in the business community, in the military space, faith leaders, we see nonprofit groups, we see scientists, political leaders all the time calling for action on climate change or supporting carbon pricing in some form. So as CCL volunteers, we see political will all around us in the form of public position statements. As volunteers, we also go out and try to generate political will. A lot of groups work on municipal resolutions. That's getting your local city or county to support a resolution in favor of carbon fee and dividend or taking action on climate change more generally. All the cities there and many more have taken a position as a result of CCL volunteers doing that work in their towns. So that's going on all over the place. The picture there is from our Flagstaff chapter when they got their resolution signed. Of course, newspapers also take a position. Some of these newspapers, in response to CCL volunteers meeting with them and encouraging them to do so and educating them on carbon fee and dividend, and some did it on their own accord. So you've got a lot of newspapers out there. And then finally, perhaps the most inspiring story, and this was part of what led to this program altogether. If you haven't heard the name Jay Butera yet, allow me to introduce you to Jay, and I'm sure you'll hear his name again and again. And this is the Jay Butera story in South Florida. So Jay is one of our volunteers. He's been with CCL for a long time, almost since the beginning. And he's from Philadelphia, but he adopted South Florida because he recognized that Florida was an area that was low-lying, so it was going to be sort of ground zero for climate change from sea level rise, things like that. It also had a very diverse delegation in Congress of Republicans and Democrats representing that area. And so he just identified that as sort of, if we're going to start the movement, it's going to be there. So he adopted South Florida. He created some chapters. He got local constituents involved, got groups going. And then he responded to what he was hearing from his members of Congress. And that was, it's great that you're bringing constituents in here, but what do my community leaders think about this? What is this going to do to businesses and whatnot? So he responded to that request. And one of the tools he created was the Leaders Letter to Congress. And basically that was a statement that prominent voices in the community could sign on to, that basically said to the member of Congress, we're constituents in your community and we would like to see you take action. And the letter was the first step for a lot of these leaders. We're talking Chamber of Commerce presidents, academic leaders, mayors, city council people, folks like that. That was the first step. And then with that first step, Jay then asked some of them to join them in meetings with members of Congress. And I think the eureka moment for me and a lot of other folks was when Jay said that when he walked into Congressman Curbelo's office with 3 Chamber of Commerce presidents on one side and 3 mayors on the other side, it totally changed the conversation. And as some of you might know, in 2016, Congressman Curbelo was a co-founder of the Climate Solutions Caucus. So the power and effectiveness of this local leader engagement became very clear to us. And we wanted to replicate that model around the country. So if we put together all of the other things I just spoke about with this amazing story from Jay, that kind of led us to identify the opportunity and how we might capture it. So the opportunity is that as CCL volunteers, we see and generate political will all the time. And if we have some way to organize, manage, cultivate, and capture it, then we can effectively share it with our members of Congress so that they feel that they have the support back in the district they need from community leaders who are going to be important once they're asked to make a decision to vote on our policy. So that leads us to the Endorser program and the outreach database. So a few definitions first. When we use the term endorser, and this is just so we're all speaking the same language here, the term endorser may be obvious, but basically that is referring to any individual or organization that we're seeking and trying to engage a position from. Usually these are folks who are influential in the community and have the ear of the member of Congress. As I said, it could be business associations, city leaders, newspapers, local governments, academic leaders, faith leaders, people like that. Endorsements basically mean any evidence from that endorser that they support action on climate change. That can come in many forms. That can come in the form of a leader's letter, which I'll talk about in a minute, a newspaper writing an editorial, a public position statement, etc. Delegate. This refers to you as the volunteer, the person who's working as the point person to a specific endorser. So the CCL volunteer who is the primary point person to the endorser, we note that in the database and you can then edit the entry for that endorser. Your role as the delegate would be to research the endorser and see if they have any public positions, to determine the most effective action for that endorser, and also to keep the database up to date. And finally, the database itself, that's basically our main contact management system and repository for all the endorsements, how we keep track of all this stuff. So the Endorser program, the way we define it is we say that it exists to support CCL chapters and action teams, and I'll talk about what action teams are in a minute. 2, first, identify community leaders. 2nd, build relationships. 3rd, solicit endorsements. And 4th and finally, demonstrate support to members of Congress. So let's talk about all 4 of those. Let's talk about the first 2 things first, which is identify community leaders and build relationships with them. Now, I want to be clear about the Endorser program's role in this. The Endorser program is really here to support chapters and action teams by providing the tools, training, and infrastructure necessary. So the Endorser program is sort of providing the infrastructure. However, we don't, as the program, we don't own the relationships with the endorsers. Instead, the relationship building is really best left to you as the volunteer in your city, your town, with your chapter, any action team that you may be a part of, because you're really in the best position to identify how to approach the endorser, how to build that relationship, and how to determine what asks to make. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But you know, we know what a chapter is. I'm sure you all are part of a CCL chapter already, or maybe you're getting one started. What is an action team? So in CCL, we have a number of these action teams, and these are teams of volunteers from various chapters around the country that are focused on a particular constituency at the local, regional, and/or national level. So, for example, we have the Agricultural Committee that works with the agricultural industry, business climate leaders that works with large Fortune 500s. We have Team Oil that works in oil and gas, with oil and gas companies and with fossil fuel heavy communities. Conservative Caucus that works on conservative outreach to Republican groups and things like that. Climate and Health, which works with the healthcare industry and so on. So we have all of these action teams. And so if this isn't, you know, if you come from a specific industry and you find that there's a team that exists already and you want to get involved with that team to outreach into that industry because of your particular background, that's great. If there's not an action team yet and you want to start one, we'd welcome that as well. Most things that happen in CCL are driven by the volunteers. So how do you find these action teams on CCL Community? If you go to CCL Community and click the Connect button at the top of the screen, or if you hover over it, you'll see a drop-down list, and one of the items will be Action Teams Directory. If you click that, you'll see this directory of action teams. They're broken into groups. There's ones for academia and education, business and labor, faith, politics, outdoors and science, etc. Not all of these action teams they functional, you know, they vary in the way that they function, but a lot of them are focused on national outreach and or regional outreach, and they are really the best place to go. So a question was asked before we started the call about, you know, how do we best start that relationship? The way that you would start a relationship with a local chamber of commerce and what your ask is there would be potentially a little bit different than what your ask would be if you engage a Fortune 500 company, which is different than if you're going to go engage a local synagogue or a corner hardware store, right? It's going to vary a lot. And so that's why we sort of refer people to the action teams as really the center of excellence for reaching out to all these different constituencies. The other thing I'd like to point you to, another resource on community for developing these relationships with potential endorsers, is our targeted resource section. So if you go again to community, if you click Take Action at the top, and on the left bar, you'll see a button that says Community Outreach. If you click that, a list of different groups or different target audiences like Catholic outreach, climate and environmental justice, conservative outreach, environmental organization, faith, etc., will pop up, and you'll be able to click on any of those. This is an evolving toolkit, and if you have anything you'd like to contribute to it, we're certainly open to it. We are working to improve it, but again, this is another place to go to find those resources. Okay, so you've started the relationship, you've identified who in the community you want to reach out to, you've figured out if there's an action team that's going to help you, you've worked with others in your chapter to get the relationship started, and that's all moving along great. How do you then solicit that endorsement, right? You've started a conversation with the endorser. How do you then ask them and move to the point where they're ready to say, yep, I'm going to give you my support, and here's how I'm going to do it? So the answer to that is whatever works best for that endorser. Depending on the endorser type, they may prefer to show their support in different ways. So CCL, one of the tools that we have is our Leaders Letter to Congress. This is modeled off of the Butera model that I talked about before. And this is a custom tool for CCL that we have that allows a community leader, whether an individual or organization that wishes to sign on. We'll show an example of this on the next slide, but this typically the types of folks or organizations that would sign on to this would be local politicians, small businesses, chambers of commerce, or presidents of a chamber, a professor, faith leader. This tends to be people who are local or regional or organizations that are local or regional in scope. If it's a newspaper, they're probably going to write an editorial, right? That's how a newspaper would show its support. If it's a local government or a local organization, they would usually pass a resolution. I showed before we have a lot of municipal resolutions. We're also working on resolutions from young Republican clubs. A native tribe has signed a resolution or issued a resolution, business associations, etc. And finally, public position statements. These are basically on-the-record positions taken by typically a large corporation that has a public policy position or a speech or an op-ed that's written by a thought leader. So we want to be able to take all of these ways of support because, again, depending on the endorser, they may be comfortable taking one action as opposed to another. And we want to be able to take all of that, capture it, and communicate it with our members of Congress. So I mentioned before the leaders letter. We have actually two leaders letter. This is, I would say that the leaders letter is sort of our default ask usually for most outreach we do. Leaders letter is usually the first place we go, but we do have all those other options depending on the endorser. We have two leaders letters. The one is basically says, I'm concerned about climate change and I'd like to see you take action. The other leader's letter says, I'm concerned about climate change and I support carbon fee and dividend. And this would be the letter that, let's say, the mayor of your city would sign on to. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of how you get that done. So there's three options to actually get the letter signed. The first is hard copy. You can print it, have them sign it, scan it, or take a picture of it on your phone, and then upload it into the database. Option two is you can actually send an electronic personal invitation to sign. So if you've entered an endorser into the outreach database, there's an option in there to actually send an electronic request. And then the third option is that you can invite somebody to sign electronically through the Leaders Letter to Congress page, which can be found at citizensclimatelobby.org/leaders. Okay, so you've gone out, you've developed a relationship, you've gotten some leaders letter signed, you're feeling good about that, you're excited about that. Now you want to communicate that to your member of Congress. How do we then demonstrate that support? And the answer is we have a lot of options. We have our national highlights reports. So there's currently two of these. We usually update these each year before our big June conference. The one on the left we developed in 2016. On the right we developed this past year. And this is really just a highlight, very kind of what are the biggest names that we've identified and what positions have they taken. And so that's what these documents are. These are really just more flashy and kind of a quick thing to show. But if you want a more detailed report, we have reports by sector. So you can see the various sectors on there, everything from faith to conservative political leaders to national security, businesses, labor unions, etc. We also have, if you're a member of Congress, though, is probably going to be more interested in what is happening in my district or my state. And so we also have district and state reports. These are emailed to liaisons, who are the point people for each member of Congress. The CCL volunteers appoint person to a member of Congress are called liaisons. They get these emailed on a monthly basis. They can also be downloaded on our website, and I'll show you where in a minute. And finally, we also have our public website, which shows the municipal resolutions and editorial endorsements. At this point, that's all that's on the website. This is probably going to expand in the future, but for now, that's what we present. You can reach that by going to citizensclimatelobby.org/endorsements. And finally, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on training for the database in this presentation. There are a lot of resources on CCL Community in the Learn section for how to use the database, and we're actually improving those very shortly. But to get into the database, this is just a screenshot of what it looks like for those of you who are on the computer share right now. And there's different views of this, and you can search and filter and do all kinds of good stuff with it. So anyway, the database, like I said, is kind of the central tool for all of this. So how are we doing? This program's been around for 2.5 years. The numbers are promising. We have over 1,800 leaders letter signatures in the system. We have over 90 municipal resolutions. This is huge. This is really impressive. I've been impressed by the number of cities and towns all across the country, as big as Salt Lake City and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and as small towns in upstate New York and Arkansas that have passed resolutions in favor of carbon fee and dividend, basically calling for Congress to act. over 70 newspaper editorials, and over 1,300 public positions of all different types have been recorded, not just carbon pricing, but also people who call this for generally for climate action, things like that. So in addition to being able to communicate support, this is also kind of a tracking tool for us to be able to track organizations as their climate positions evolve. So how do you get started? Well, there's two things I want to point you to. The first is sort of the hub of how to get into the program. Again, if you go to the Take Action Center, that's where most things in CCL are. If you go to the Take Action Center, you can find most things that you need. Click Take Action, and then on the left side, click Seek Endorsements. And it will bring up this page here, which has pretty much the entire toolkit of everything you need. There's a link to the outreach database right at the top, and then all of these tabs will pretty much walk you through the process of learn about it. It'll have some educational resources, prepare. You can print the leaders' letters here, plan for your meeting, and there's some resources about how to plan for your meeting. And anyway, and then of course the endorsement reports section here as well. So all the reports I showed earlier, you can download from that endorsement reports section. In addition, you'll notice on community, there are different forums, different groups. If you hover over the connect button at the top, you'll see one of the options says endorser delegates. If you join that forum on community, then you'll find all of the other delegates and volunteers around the country who are interested in this. You can post questions there, you can post comments there, suggestions. If you have a great success story you want to share, whatever you want to post, that's the place to do it. That's where the forum exists to communicate with others. And finally, this is sort of the default fail-safe. If you are having problems figuring something out, if you can't, if you need a question answered, we have the Endorser help desk that can be reached at endorse@citizensclimatelobby.org. It can also be reached if you're in CCL community. You'll see a little envelope on the bottom right of the screen, and you can always send a help email the help desk through there. And Endorser questions are one of the options there. Either way, you can email the help desk. They're there to answer your questions. They're there to, if you're having a problem uploading something to the database, they can do that. If you have a list of contacts that you've been working with your chapter and you want to get them into the database and import them, they can import those lists for you and help you with that.
The outreach section. So we're going to have you visit the database. If you haven't already, that's the pathway. And then we're going to have you go to that, preferably the advanced search, and you can look within your chapter. If you already have a name, you can just do a simple search. If that's going to be too overwhelming otherwise, we're not going to be particular. We just want you to get used to this. And then really start monkeying around, seeing who comes up. And in your partner group, kind of walk each other through. Chances are you're probably going to be with somebody else that could maybe use a little bit more support, or would love to have a chance to also hear what you're thinking for ideas and bounce off of your kind of thoughts from them. And then essentially kind of we're going to ask you to add them to the database and set a plan to outreach to them.
The outreach database, which again can be reached by going to the Take Action Center at the top. And then actually, if you're looking at the screen here, you see the red trail. Take Action and then Seek Endorsements, and you'll see a link to the outreach database. You could probably also use the search utility and search for outreach database. There are a lot of tabs on the top of the screen here, and I'm not going to go through all that. Most of you will only see a few of these tabs, probably the first three. The very first tab is Search. The next tab is My Endorsers, and the third is Advanced Search. I'm going to show you two quick things that we might want to do tonight. So there's really two ways to get started. The first is if you want to search to see if somebody's already in there. And so when you come in and you search, you start on the search screen, you can type in a name. So I don't know, I know Cisco, the food services company is one we just added, so I'm going to put that in here. So if you hit search, you'll see it'll come up and you'll say, Cisco Corporation is in here. The delegate, meaning the CCL volunteer, it's already assigned. Somebody's already working on this one. And so in that case, you might want to apply to be a delegate, which would mean that a request would go in to say, hey, I'm also interested to work with, in this case, Dory on this one. But, and so that's if you find an entry. If you don't find an entry, let's say you type in Cisco, but you really meant some other entity, you say, oh, good. they're not in here yet. The way you could add them is you then click this button right here that says add an endorser, and you can go ahead and add a new endorser. This window will pop up and just kind of walks you right through it. And you click add endorser, click add endorser, and then you can fill that form out. So that's the first thing I'll show. The other way, so you can find out if your endorser's in there. The other thing you can do is if you go to the advanced search tab, this is a much more, if you're comfortable with databases, this probably looks comfortable to you. If you're not a computer person, you might say, oh my gosh, what am I looking at here? But basically, this is a filterable view. So the search tab is kind of a very simple, just type in a name, see what comes up. This is a much more robust kind of filter search capability. You can enter your chapter name in. So I'm going to enter in, for example, the Houston Montrose chapter here. And as you'll see, there are a number of entries that come up, different businesses and folks. And so you can look through and see what entries are already assigned to your chapters. Some chapters may have a lot. We have a lot here in Houston. Some chapters you might not have any, or you might have like just a Chamber of Commerce that was imported in a big import exercise we did. So I guess for this exercise, we just want you to get familiar with who your chapter is already working with and see if you want to add a new entry of somebody you might want to reach out to.
So thank you so much for being on the call tonight. Happy Halloween, everyone, and good luck getting that first endorsement. This is an absolutely critical area for us to really engage in as volunteers throughout the country.